We've got two speakers this afternoon, and without further ado, the first speaker is right here next to me, and that's Tony Green, who you all know as the head of finance at the New Economic Foundation. And if we look to his background, he's actually been one of those, we don't want to talk about the investment bankers, shame on you, we'll have the luncheon party later. He's also a chartered accountant.
Who are you?
Who am I? Oh, you weren't here yesterday, obviously. My name is Ulrich Fahl from Menthaler. I work for the Fortune Foundation, so I'm nobody of importance. So without further ado, I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of this gentleman who has come from the dark side to the good side. So that's him now.
Thank you, Ulrich. So this is quite a treat for me, actually, because we've had all these very fantastic presentations which are dealing with big concepts and theories and some quite difficult conceptual stuff. What I'm just going to get to present to you is some practical projects that are happening on the ground, and a project in particular I want to introduce you to, which NEF is involved with, which is going to be tracking 6 complementary currencies over the next 2 years in the Northwest Europe region. So that's why the map is up there. You get a clue from the mobile phone that I'll be talking about mobile phone payment. Though some people might recognise that there's a picture of the Bank of England. Does anybody want to tell me what the one on the far left is?
City of London.
City of London, thank you. Yes, that is the emblem of the City of London, which stands at the border of the magic square mile that surrounds the Bank of England, which is the centre of all, as we were learning yesterday from Ellen, the centre of all monetary evil. So I'll explain why I've got pictures of them up in a second. This is when I cover some developments in the field from a UK perspective. Then I'm going to talk about a partnership we have with an organisation called Coin in the Netherlands, and some practical projects that we are involved in the UK. And then I'm going to talk about the new project, Community Currencies in Action, which is an EU-funded or part-funded project. So, perspective from the UK. A tale of two cities. This has been a very interesting few months for complementary currencies in the UK, because on the one hand I went to a meeting in the City of London held by the City of London Corporation. This is the financial sector's lobbying organisation in the UK, where they are holding, getting very excited about the concept of capacity exchange. Now most of you will perhaps sort of recognise that what they're talking about there is effectively a complementary currency. They're talking about exchanges, in fact, between large companies and governments. But it is a form of complementary currency, and I had this bizarre experience of being in the same room as the Corporation of London, together with social community currency campaigners, all discussing the same thing. Where that goes remains to be seen. At the other end of the scale, the Bristol Pound, which is a project, Bristol is a city in the west of England, is one of our projects where we have a complementary currency, and that is currently having a little bit of a rough ride from the regulatory authorities in the UK, the Financial Services Authority, the Bank of England, and Her Majesty's Treasury, none of whom seem particularly keen to see this complementary currency that would serve a city region of 1 million people come into existence anytime soon. So these are sort of, I'm just setting the scene here for some of it. It's a confusing picture because there appears to be, on the one hand, great interest amongst policymakers and governments in what complementary currencies could potentially do, particularly for social purposes. But at the same time, it's still marginalised. There's still no really regulatory framework to allow these things to happen, and plenty of obstacles in the way. But we do see demand from communities very interested in setting up their own complementary currencies. So the question is, how can we meet that demand? How can we help this revolution start to happen from the ground up, as Pat and Shan were both arguing before the break, is the way that really it should happen? Well, here's some stuff that we've been doing. We think it's about, there's a lot of questions about capacity. Now, I mean, there's a huge wealth of knowledge that exists already in people who've done and have dreamt up and operated community currency schemes. we're not necessarily adding much that's new to that, but what we're trying to do is build capacity and spread that knowledge and bring it together. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And so the way we've done that is we've got the partnership. We had some investment from some grant-giving foundations, and we have done a new ICT platform for community currencies based on Cyclos, which I'm sure more than one of you will be familiar with. That's the Stro software platform. That's an open source software platform that enables a mobile phone-based community currency, which I'll have a little demonstration in a second. And what we're kind of trying to do is also add capacity around solving some of the legal and compliance questions, and to sort of spread knowledge about best practice in how to make these schemes successful, how to make sure that people actually use these currencies. So that's what we've been doing. One of the first, well, in fact, the first pilot to launch was Brixton, the Brixton Pound, which is an area in inner city London. And that's shown as one of the logos on there. These are the people who have been involved in it. Lambeth is the local authority, the municipality in that area. The credit union is involved. And I mentioned already we're also launching one in Bristol, and there's some Dutch pilots as well. So this is just a way really of beginning to organise our approach, which we're trying to develop, to sort of build capacities for communities to implement currencies. So, I mean, there are these three areas very important: impact, implementation, and business rules. I'm going to talk briefly about some of these in turn. Impact. You know, what we find, and I think this would have been covered by other speakers actually this morning as well, is that you have to start with the question, what am I trying to achieve with my currency? What is the objective? What's the goal? If you're not very clear about that, then you will run into difficulties. And there's this sort of phrase that I've heard before, that very often complementary currencies are solutions looking for problems. Well, it's quite important to identify what problem it is you're solving, otherwise the solution won't necessarily fit it. So that's really a little bit about that. An area which NEF is very, this is sort of where hopefully we can actually add some value to this whole growing field, is in the evaluation of impact and outcomes, which is obviously, as an economics think tank, is an area that we have a reputation in evaluating social and ecological impacts as well as economic ones. So that's something which we'll be trying to develop some tools for, which we can share with people running currencies to assist them in demonstrating impact, or measuring the impact of what they're trying to achieve. A little word about business rules. Some very obvious ones here that you have to go through. What is the unit of account? Is it kilowatt hours? Is it hours? Is it just something that tracks a legal tender currency? How is it that you will determine the value and make this thing desirable and acceptable? How will you guarantee that? Very crucially, how will you create your money, and then how will you take it out of circulation at the end? And probably the most crucial thing of all is how will you ensure that people actually use it and the currency circulates? So are there enough incentives in there? Because what we have found with community currencies in the UK is that you will get a certain amount of the population engaging with it out of the sheer sort of philosophical belief in supporting greater social capital and local economic resilience. You will get a certain number of people engaging, but maybe never more than 5%. In order to make the breakthrough, to get a bigger proportion of people in an area using the currency, there's got to be a financial incentive in there for them. This is the view we're coming to. Implementation, well, I've just mentioned a few words there. I mean, these are the kind of obvious ones, really. These are things which you have to figure out the answers to in order to successfully implement. I'll pick out governance. You know, we're in the business of trying to run schemes which are social schemes, really, and so the governance, democracy and transparency and accountability, we want to always be exemplary, because these are features of the current system which we all criticise. So, and I mentioned there, we've sort of done this version of Cyclos, which communities can use to create their own currency and to transfer it. And you know, I like to say, because it's true, that we launched in Brixton, the Brixton Pound was the first mobile phone payment system launched in the UK. Barclays will tell you that it was their system, it's called Pingit, but they're wrong. So, we can, if you mind clicking on the top link, the Vimeo one, there's a sort of 1.5 minute video demonstrating how it works.
So I thought I'd go down
fruits and vegetables today, and I'm going to show you how you can actually pay for things with nothing more than your mobile phone and a text message using electronic Brixton pounds. Hi there, can I get some of the chochos? Yeah, I'll get 4. How much are they? 60 pence. So I'll just send you the text, just do my PIN, and it's Sana Foods, isn't it? That's right. That's yeah, okay. And £2.40. Okay, yeah. That seems to have gone through, I think. Hopefully you should get a message as well. Yeah, thank you. Okay, right. Thank you very much. So, Brixton pound you have received. Welcome to the revolution. So that was you could see there that there was Simon Wolfe, who's the director of one of the directors of Brixton Pound, paying by text in Brixton Pounds, which is the online. There's an online bank account which I won't have time to go into, but the link there. It looks exactly like when you go online. It looks like a regular bank's online banking system. You see your balance, you see the transactions that you've made using Brixton Pounds. You can actually make the transfers also online, but the primary, obviously, innovation there is the ability to use your phone to go and pay down there in Brixton Market, for example, to that trader. And what's quite interesting about that is that's a trader who may well have not been taking electronic payments before, because it's quite expensive to take card payments, right? You've got to hire a terminal from your bank. You may pay 2.5% per transaction as a fee to take that electronic payment. We make a transaction charge, but it's much lower and there's no monthly fee. So this is actually a commercially competitive proposition for small traders for the first time to be able to receive electronic payment without having to pay Visa or a local bank a huge amount of money effectively for that privilege. So that's the Brixton Pound. Now, the project that we're coming up to, actually won't go through that, that's just the sort of consultancy phase of the implementation. I'll talk now about the project that we're just starting. So, Community Currencies in Action. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the complicated world of EU projects, but anyway, this is an interreg project. It means interregional. It's all about interregional cooperation. This is the Northwest Europe region, and the countries involved I'll comment on in a second. This is the project. It has 8 partners. It will go over 3 years, although we're already 6 months into it. 6.4 million euros. Unfortunately, we don't get that money from the EU. We have to prove we've spent 6.4 million euros between us, and then they'll give us half. So we need to find match funding for that. There are 6 demonstration schemes. We'll talk a little bit more about these in detail, but they're spread across Belgium, France, London, Wales, and in Amsterdam. 2 of them are primarily economic currencies aiming to improve the resilience of the local economy, the flow of money around the local economy to benefit local independent traders. 2 of them are trying to encourage and reward and stimulate more ecologically friendly consumption behaviours or waste disposal behaviours amongst the population. And 2 of them are aimed at improving social outcomes in very deprived areas by finding a way of including particularly sort of youths who are unemployed, back into the labour market. So there's a variety of different schemes with different goals, as you could say. Well, those are the partners laid out there. I mean, I just want to make the point that we have some local government partners involved here, as well as NGOs, various NGOs. And as I say, the areas across Northwest Europe. So this is actually the final slide that I'm going to talk to. But really, I guess to all of you in the room, I wanted to present the fact that this is happening, that we're going to have these pilot projects. Various things we're going to try to achieve over this, this sort of 2-year period, really. And those are some of the key outputs. So to solve some of the legal challenges that these schemes are beginning to face, and I described to you the difficulties that Bristol Pound is facing in getting its scheme approved. This hopefully will include actually setting up a licensed e-money institution in the EU, to further develop the software tools that are available and to make those available basically on a variety of bases, open source or along with paid-for consultancy support to implement for those communities that don't have the ICT skills themselves. And then this point, communities of practice, well, this is sort of very relevant to what this conference is really. You know, we are very aware that there is a huge diversity and wealth of experience already out there, indeed over many years, in setting up and running complementary currency schemes. And so we are keen in trying to work with everybody in the field, really, and use this project as a vehicle through which we can possibly, you know, use the resources that we're going to get from the EU to share learning and evaluation sort of methodologies and all the other things which we're going to try and do. So that's the research element as well. And I guess, you know, one key way in which we're going to try and do this is to set up what we're calling the Knowledge Centre, but, you know, there are already websites, which some of you may know, which have you know, a lot of content on them, a list of different schemes that exists. So we are trying to, if you like, create a portal where we can put all our new material, but also point to all the other material that we can find that's already out there, and that hopefully can be used as a helpful resource. So, yeah, I mean, that's all I wanted to say, really. It's an introduction to the project, and it's also an invitation to everyone here to take the opportunity to engage with this sort of process, and to work with us on designing new ways of evaluating the impact of these currencies, to help convince policymakers and regulators to not quash them, but to actually welcome them, because they do actually meet some of the social, environmental and economic goals that governments have. That's our argument. And here's some further information that you can find on our website, COIN. That rather long URL is the details of the actual project if you want to find that, but we will soon be setting up a website with all these details on. And if you like Twitter, then there's a few Twitter feeds to follow as well. So I look forward to having any questions that you've got about those. Perhaps I can tell you more about the detail of the 6 projects that are happening, the currency schemes and how they work, or any other questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Now, we are running a little bit behind on schedule, so I'm going to be very short and introduce the next speaker who will then tell you all about himself. And I'm terribly sorry, Tony, to have been draconian, but it's incredibly interesting, but the time is short. I was asked only to say his name and his affiliation, and he would do all the rest. So, without further ado, here's Sigouris Sigouridis, which sounds incredibly Greek, but he comes from, he's an associate professor, and this is where it becomes confusing, of Engineering Systems and Management at Masdar Institute in Abu Dhabi. So, we're listening to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Tony, for setting the stage, essentially. Now, the title that is shown in the program, it says the Masdar City case. It was a mistake that essentially there was my email to the organizers went to spam. So the actual title of the presentation that I have here was not written in the program. Now, the Masdar City is actually shown up there. It's the middle picture here. That's the development that is currently happening in Abu Dhabi. And the idea is to have a city that is zero carbon emissions and that will act as an innovation hub for renewable energy technologies. So it's actually quite an interesting and innovative project. And as we were working towards it and trying to figure out how to do actually the energy accounting for a city that has a zero carbon emissions target, is where the idea of energy credits that is part of my presentation today is going to be. Now, essentially, by doing this thinking process, we are trying to answer the questions that were, I think, legitimately asked earlier from the speakers and also from the participants is exactly how does this system can work. I mean, you cannot just say that, okay, here is 1 kilowatt hour backed currency, right? How does it actually work? Now, the point of my presentation is packed in 2 papers, one that describes the energy credit system that we call the ERGO system, and then a thought paper about how that can transition into an energy currency system that is under review and is available on SSRM, is the topic of the presentation today. Now, these are topics that we have already discussed, so I'm going to go fast. I'll just quote here Minsky, which I think answers one of the reasons of why do we go to an energy currency. Minsky says that finance sets the pace for the economy. That's critical, right? How fast is the economy growing is set by finance. Now, how fast can actually the economy grow? That's the question. And the question is that it's bounded by its physical constraints, right? So how can we connect it? Now, as recovery approaches full employment, soothsayers will proclaim that the business cycle has been banished and debts can be taken on. So debts are highlighted here by me. Essentially, that's future consumption that we are saying we can actually produce. And that's where the 2 things go together. In truth, neither the boom and certainly not the recovery of full employment growth can go on forever. The point that you cannot have exponential growth, so each state nurtures forces that lead to its own destruction. So, moving ahead, this is a picture, I mean, just to see a bit of how the economy today has been changing. The connection between GDP, a common measure of economic output, and oil price worked in the 70s. Well, yeah, we see the kind of the jump in oil prices from the oil embargo, but then basically the economy is resilient. I mean, it goes into a recession, but not much. In the notes, it's a totally different behavior. I mean, the scale is different because it's normalized, and you can see that the economy really hits a dip comparatively, right? It's definitely not a steady state. So we're going, another component here of the discussion that I actually pointed out earlier, that essentially we're going into a phase shift of fossil fuel supply. We can see that at one point, the price of oil was elastic. As demand went up, price went up. As demand went down, price went down. We're not seeing the same thing. Today, no matter how high demand goes, no matter how high price goes, I mean, essentially demand stays the same. Right? So that's where the inelasticity comes in. So the argument that has been made by several others, including Douthwaite, is that essentially what tipped the house of cards that we had for the financial crisis, of course, that's not the cause of it. We know that the cause is the institutional structure of the financial system. But what tipped it is that people could actually not afford the energy prices that they had to pay. So they had to choose between paying their mortgage and actually paying their electricity bills. Right, so this is a reason that essentially what started the collapse of the system that we're still living today. And the reason is now, that's where we are starting to go into the fact that, okay, how to tie energy and currency, is that essentially what we are perceiving is that we are perceiving a hidden externalities of the system. So we have 2 things that are embedded in all these bills, and essentially we don't know exactly how much energy we are using, and we don't know what this energy is actually costing to our planet. So it's a double hidden externality. So basically, in the 90s, I mean, in the 2000s, we had the first actual collision between the physical and financial economy. And that's not yet critical. I mean, we still have enough fossil fuel to take us over, but we don't know for how much longer. Now, can we make that transition to a sustainable society in a voluntary manner? So that's kind of the question. I mean, whether we can do it voluntarily. I mean, it will happen one way or the other. And the question is whether we can do it at as least pain as possible. So as a first step, I will define how to kind of account for, I mean, essentially formalize how we account for a sustainable transition. And then present the ERGO concept that actually helps the transition, at least in theory, for certain communities. And then who could potentially lead as an adoption of this system. And then what kind of, how can we move from a credit system to a currency system? So the first principle, so and there are 4 principles that I think are important to account for a society that transitioned to a sustainable state. And the first 3 are coming from Daly. And the fourth one is, I think, what is combining. It's actually something that I introduce here. Now, the first part is that the renewable capital consumption should be less than the long-term ecosystem carrying capacity. So basically, we cannot pay the entire Earth with solar panels. That will create an ecosystem problem, right? So there is a limit. Now, what that limit is not something we discussed today. The point is that we have to find that limit and be below it. The second part is the rate of pollution emission is less than the ecosystem assimilated capacity. Now, what is important in terms of the energy system today is, and the key constraint is the greenhouse gas emissions. So that constraint can actually easily be defined. So basically, your fossil fuel emissions should be less than the limit. And actually, according to many studies, that limit in the long run is actually zero. Right? So we actually need to go to essentially fossil-free societies. Now, finally, and that's kind of where it starts getting interesting in terms of how do we transition to that society, is that, okay, we're using fossil fuels. We actually developed our civilization on the energy density of fossil fuels. Now, how do we transition? We need to make sure that the investment in renewable energy capital is actually higher than that equation there, basically, which actually ties how much fossil fuel energy we're getting, and then how much are we using it, and then what is the energy return on energy investment from the renewable energy technology that we are actually implementing. So that actually can give us a number, and I can tell you that we are much below that in terms of investment today. And finally, and that's where it ties all together, is that the amount of debt, basically, that we are assuming, the committed renewable energy investment should be proportional to the current consumption committed, which is the amount of debt. So essentially, and if you see here the ratio of debt to GDP, this is actually debt assumed at a certain time, but since we are starting from zero, you can actually assume that as cumulative debt. And that's where our renewable energy commitment should be coming. So basically, we're tying how much energy we're going to be producing renewably in the future with how much debt we're giving ourselves today, right? So now, who would be actually leading adopters? Today, this is kind of a matrix that we can actually consider for this concept. So you have, on the one side, you have capacity or power constraints, and on the other side, you have energy constraints. Right, so our societies so far are in these quadrants here. Basically, we have essentially unlimited, or what we consider unlimited, fossil fuel resources, and we have actually the ability to manage our power. So, I mean, if we want to turn on the light at some time, we have enough power in reserve to give us that light. Now, where the problem starts is when we start to move towards the right side, I mean, the top right side, where you essentially don't have that capacity. You have to rely on your own energy resources. And of course, that happens in disconnected communities, autonomous cities, or here it is a little less constrained. You have a voluntary target. You say, okay, I want to meet my energy targets from my own renewable energy sources, but I make the task easier because I'm connected to the grid. So I just need to make sure that the accounting is correct. So this is where essentially the Masdar City case starts from. We are using the grid as our energy storage device. Now, the point here is that as communities, even with fossil fuel availability, as we enter into a renewable energy target or into energy independence targets, then we start moving ourselves voluntarily into that quadrant. So what type of communities are these? One is, for example, there is discussion in Switzerland about the 2000-watt society. Right? So that gives you actually immediately an energy limit per person per year. That's coming to about 70,500 kilowatt hours per person per year. Now, other communities like Masdar City, essentially you put a very aggressive target, zero carbon emissions. But then you have communities like actually within the European Union itself, but also cities in the European Union that set themselves with a covenant of mayors specific renewable energy targets. So these are potential users, adopters of this system. Now, these are the needs that we need to kind of account for, essentially energy balancing, but also demand management. That's kind of where things get tricky in terms of how we can use an energy credit system. And that's what we are trying to assess here. Now, one way to resolve the problem is to say, okay, and it's actually considered, people don't have power or control over their consumption. You can set the thermostat remotely. You can essentially limit how much light is available, right? So, but I mean, that creates a system that is not, you're not allowed, it's not going to be accepted as a technocratic dictatorship now. So, can we do that in a way that is not, that is essentially democratic? And this is kind of my comment here, ergo. Ergo is the Greek word for work. That's the choice for the energy credit system that they're proposing. Introduce energy as a parallel currency. Keep in mind, this is parallel for the time being. So how does that work? You have essentially a dual account system, where on one hand, you have the actual ergo system that has one unit of energy. It can be kilowatt hour, it can be anything else. That we don't specify. But there is an exchange with a fiat currency. That's why it's parallel currency. That is important in terms of power management. So essentially, you have the key components here is that you need to issue the ergos, right? And that's the energy output. You need to allocate them somehow, and the allocation is not just happening on a per person basis, but also on a time basis. So if your system is actually producing more energy in the winter, but you need more energy in the summer to actually consume, how are you going to do this time allocation? I mean, that depends also on how your system is set up. Now, once these ergos are somehow allocated and distributed, then they are surrendered for energy services. And now, a key component here on making this work is that we create an asymmetric spot market. And the asymmetric part is, as I will explain a bit later, is that once ergos are allocated, and you consider it as cell phone minutes, let's say in a plan, in a cell phone plan, right? Everyone gets the same, or it depends on how much you are subscribing for. But once you use those that are allocated to you, you are still allowed to actually consume more. But how do you consume more? You actually have to immediately buy and surrender ergos, energy credits basically, from the spot market. That is, now the price for the spot market is it's interesting how do you set that price. Now, why is it asymmetric? You cannot buy it speculatively. So you have to buy at the given price and then surrender it immediately. If you don't want, I mean, essentially you have to make a choice. Either you use your own ergos, or you buy and surrender immediately something that is traded in the market. Now, the point is here to make energy tangible, so it actually reflects exactly how the energy system operates, right? And the key point here is that you cannot store energy. In the fossil-heavy system, your energy storage is coming, I mean, basically it's your reserves in the ground. But in a renewable energy system, storage is expensive, right? Someone mentioned batteries earlier. Batteries are extremely expensive. Of course, you can say that in an unlimited system we would have batteries, but that's not the solution today. We are working towards having higher and cheaper energy storage, but it's not there today. And it's probably not going to be, we have to match our demand to our supply. And that's why ergos have a validity period. You can play with a validity period and make sure that it can happen like every hour, or every 24 hours, or every week. So that's kind of part of what the system, how the system can play in terms of meet the demands of energy. Now, in terms of fungibility, is that essentially people can trade. Figure out at what price they are interested in actually trading, surrendering their right to consume energy, and the right to and the price of the market. Now, you say, okay, that gets too complicated, right? I have to continuously check the price. Well, the thing is that through mobile phones, you can have that in terms of algorithmically set. You set your preferences, and you let the phone actually do the trading for you. So that's the way to resolve it. The coverage is basically in the city, you would have the electricity coverage, climate control, water and hot water, transportation, waste disposal, common utilities. So these are kind of the coverage, this is the coverage of the system. Now I have 3 minutes here. Was this 3 minutes?
3 minutes.
Okay. That's
It was 3 minutes.
Well, I guess in the paper you can see exactly how that operates in terms of the ergo budget and then how the actual allocation happens. So I'll just go through this slide, which explains it. The pricing mechanism. Now, essentially you set a curve that is your cumulative supply curve, which is what you actually want your demand to be. As this diverges, so that's how the spot price actually changes. If you have a higher demand, cumulative than supply, then your price slowly starts increasing, so that people respond to that signal. And now I'm just going to go and discuss very briefly this move from credits to currency, how that can happen. Is essentially to start using a credit system as a currency is an evolutionary process. I mean, people, once they have a value associated with it, they can say, okay, I'm actually going to trade you for whatever you're giving me, I'm going to give you credits, right? So they start using it not just as actually surrendering as a value for energy, but also as a means of transaction, of completing a transaction. But still the amount of energy within the economy remains steady. Now, a key to the transition here, and I actually had to jump over that, was the fact that you can actually create part of your ergo supply can come from the future. Essentially, that's where it becomes, it allows people to actually store value. And where is the future coming from? Essentially, it is indicating future energy generation. So ergo futures are something that can be traded symmetrically. It's something, at one time, they are supposed to start becoming regular ergos. They actually, at one point, they have an activation period, right? But until that time, they're actually traded they can be traded as a currency. And that's where you can actually bank these futures. So once you can complete your transition by having ergo futures pricing the actual ergo spot market. Right? So that's where, and this is kind of the difference between energy credits and energy currency. Now, in terms of how does it connect to the macroeconomy, it's interesting to notice that for most cases, this is actually life cycle input for essentially for the entire US economy, for the different sectors of the economy, 243 sectors. How much energy we are getting in, this is here, and then how much value is actually being added to the economy. And that's on a life cycle basis. And you can see here that there is definitely a clear trend, right, a clear correlation. But you have some sectors that are kind of off value, right? Actually, this is the power sector. And there is a reason why that is off value, because it's actually being used to supplement its activities. So it's basically the main comment here is that once we transition to an energy currency, our valuation of common goods will not change that drastically. With that, I finish, and I hope you can have a chance to read the papers.
Again, I do apologize for being draconian, but it has taken us right to the end of the session. We have exactly 1 minute for questions, and I'm keeping you from your coffee. So there's 2 ways around this. Either we have 1 minute for questions and back to coffee, 2, we overrun, or 3, which is my suggestion, you start asking the questions. If you want a coffee, go out and get one. All right? That way we still have the question section, because I think, I have the impression that there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of material here that we want to discuss. So if you want a quick coffee, go out and get one. Let the others stay here and let's start the discussions. All right? Please, the floor's open. The gentleman with the beard, yes, you were first, and then the lady in front of you. Oh, hi. Sorry, I didn't recognize you with that.
Question for Tony. You said that the Brickstone currency, there was no charge, unlike a Visa card, for example. So how do they fund these transactions?
No, sorry, there's no standing monthly charge, but there's a transaction charge of 1.5%. So that's how, eventually the model should be self-financing.
I have a question for Tony. It looks like if my battery goes dead, I'm going to stop. I'm kidding. The question I have is it possible to get these phones and use inherited knowledge to give everybody who we give a phone to at least a certain amount of money using the 1% who can afford it to the people who can use the phones who can't afford it? That's one question. And the question I have for, I forgot, sorry, I forgot the name. The question I have for you, is it possible to get, again, the inherited wealth and accumulative knowledge we have, to put these systems in third world nations to give a better quality of life? In other words, the point of this technology is to distribute it better, and it's great technology on both sides. But if it doesn't benefit the rest of society, what good are we doing?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. As regards the Brixton pound and also the Bristol pound versions, these are sterling-backed currency models. So in other words, you buy Bristol pounds by giving over your British pounds. My point is that we can't, it's not one where you can issue credit really under this model. Although there's, I guess, if there's an ambition that's sort of lurking in the background with all of these currencies, you introduce them with a one-for-one backing with legal tender to get them accepted and to build trust, and then at some point in the future you detach from the legal tender, and then you'd be in a position to do the sort of things you're talking about and issue credit, interest-free credit, to everybody to represent a social dividend or some of the things that Pat was talking about, or inherited knowledge as he put it. I think that certainly is something that we'd like to do eventually. On the point about the well, and actually, given time, I'll hand over.
Okay, so I guess I can respond to Jeff's question. And it seems to be a recurring question, right, that you are asking. My opinion is that we cannot solve everything in one go. In the specific system that we are considering here, and I think also, much less in the Bristol pound, but it is actually intended for specific societies and communities that have reached a certain level of sophistication and energy generation capacity, right? So, I mean, that's true, and I'm not arguing that it actually can solve the third world problems as it is. But my general comment is that if we actually move to essentially somehow, one way or another, be it through an energy currency, or be it through some kind of debt control, something, tie our global growth to our energy capacity constraints and resource constraints in general, then everyone will be better off. So I think that's my second comment.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, a question for Tony, and it follows on from your just previous answer there. I really like the fact that you said that you want to channel these resources into supporting the movement or profession as a whole, this emerging field of practice we're engaged in. And you've also expressed an interest eventually to look at how the currencies that you're involved in can also create an autonomous means of exchange, self-issued or mutually issued credit. I'm a bit nervous in that word eventually. Can you provide me some reassurance that you're going to look at this in your work in the coming year, given that there are already many existing tried and tested examples of mutual credit and self-issued credit which need to be part of this emerging movement and profession, rather than set up as something else almost in competition with what we're doing?
No, I completely agree with you. And one of there are 6 schemes in this EU project. One of them is intending to set up a mutual credit as a business-to-business scheme. Personally, and I think colleagues at NEF would agree, the scheme I'm most sort of keen to see happen next in the UK is a mutual credit type scheme, precisely so that it is detached from the existing system. We have this one model which is a sterling-backed system, but it's only one of various models that are going on at the moment. But absolutely, we want to do that, and that's one where again, mutual credit type systems, if you use that term broadly to include LETs and so on, or even time-based ones, you could say, have been around a long time. So we're not going to try and reinvent the wheel.
Please.
Quick question, Tony. GDP, GNP was set up to measure, essentially as a measure of the economy to be used as a tax rate. So that's why it was created. In these complementary/alternative currencies, the government probably will not be able to apply its standards for measurement to those currencies, even if they can measure them. So how does that work from their point of view?
Yeah, well, I mean, the issues of tax always looms large in complementary currency systems, but the advantage of the disadvantage of the Brixton Power model is that it doesn't allow a community to create its own credit, but the advantage is that it slots very neatly into the existing systems of accounting and tax. So from the authority's point of view, they're very easy, you don't have too many issues. So, I mean, I guess I don't really have a final answer for you on that, apart from that whole section about tax and regulation is one of the areas of study which we want to try and add to some knowledge during this project.
Yes, thank you. I have a question to Zgouris. You mentioned in your presentation briefly the Covenant of Mayors. Could you explain what is its role in that project?
Actually, I just mentioned it as potential adopters. Essentially, whenever a community sets a target, a renewable energy penetration target, it's actually setting itself an energy target. Because renewable energy generation at any given point in time is limited. So, by default, that is an energy target, and that's what my argument was, that these communities could actually adopt the system to meet and do the energy accounting this way, with the energy credit system.
Right. Nobody else? Last chance? Oh.
Okay, just a question about the correlation between at macro level between energy output and the value added. Actually, I think that we need also to go beyond gross national products, and so define the measure of unit of currency, take into account also the natural resources, for example, the natural capital that are not included in the GDP, and is our goal to overcome this kind of measure that is not more sufficient to actually measure our wellness, our well-being, and it's only economic performance. And so we should reach these other goals that are beyond the currency, the new currencies, and the new way of transaction between services and services and goods and services, etc.
There was one question, gentleman.
Can I just clarify something here? Actually, I do think I agree with you absolutely. And just to clarify, in the slide where I had the figure, it was not GDP. It was not actually, I was not talking, unlike other speakers that actually use the correlation between GDP and energy, which is a valid comparison. What I showed is for individual sectors of the economy, let's say if for car producing, let's say, how much energy does it go in its life cycle? And how much does value added it provides to the economy? That includes how much people are paid, how much people who are paid, they are actually buying things in the economy. So it's a life cycle, economic life cycle, and the energy life cycle. And we just show also a very strong correlation. But I agree with you that in terms of actually valuing our resources is key. And that's why kind of the energy currency is actually stated that explicitly values the availability of the energy resource. Right? It doesn't value everything, but it does value one thing, which is a key constraint.
Well, I mean, I agree with both of your comments, and I know that in the presentation on the Energy Money report, we very much make the point that the money system needs to take better account of nature. As the point on GDP, you were absolutely right. I mean, NEF has been a long-term critic, as have other people who presented at this conference, of thinking that GDP or GNP is any measure of human progress. It simply isn't. I mean, it does measure something, but it's not the thing that's the most important thing. And so we also have strands of work that try to, have been arguing for a long time that measures of well-being should replace GDP as the prime determinant of government policy. So, you know, at the same time, we need to improve money, but we must never forget that there is a whole economy, if you like, that is not monetized and perhaps never should be. And people refer to the love economy, and we talk about the core economy at NEF to make the point that a lot of what happens outside monetary transactions is more important to life than the monetary transactions. So I completely sympathise with what you said.
And we will have the very last question.
Last question. Do you hear me? I would like to congratulate both your initiatives because I really like them. But how do you protect them against the powers that are now in control, who need to operate in a growth-based, interest-based, debt-based system? Because they won't like your system at a certain moment when it grows too big. They will have to take it over, or they will have to collapse because they have to pay their own debts too. So how do you protect it? Question is to both.
Well, that's a good question, and I shall answer it like this. It might seem like a colleague of mine was emailed me from a train. He was on a train journey going through the middle of England, last week, and he said there was a delay. The train was delayed, and one of the passengers very loudly was complaining about how useless the train company was, and everybody was agreeing. And then somebody else shouted out, "Well, at least they're not as bad as the bankers." And the whole carriage erupted with applause and cheering, and this is normally how English people behave. So I just mentioned that because there is a strong supporter, potentially, of some particularly business-focused credit schemes, and the Swiss VIR is always a great sort of example to point to, where I feel that there comes a point where if you like, the productive economy begins to, which includes business people, rebels against the financial economy because it just finds itself so constrained, and small businesses are going out of business daily in Britain for lack of working capital because the financial system is dysfunctional. So there could be a case for just looking for those allies within the system that have an interest in tackling financial capital, and sometimes those allies may themselves be part of the system and quite powerful, and maybe that's the way that you can try to achieve some change. Now that may be unrealistic, but we'll see.
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's not an easy question to answer. Just from my perspective, in the first place, I think the energy credit system is designed to be essentially under the radar of the financial system. So you start from a point where the financial system is not exactly interested in you, right? And then once you grow, maybe you grow fast enough or at a point where it becomes too strong to actually stop it somehow. But that's just a hope. The reality is that we cannot be thinking about everything. So essentially I'm inviting you and others to consider the implications of the political power games that can be reliant on an energy currency system. I'm just saying, okay, this is how it could work.
Thank you, both of you, for very interesting presentations. I can see there's lots of questions left. It is, however, 14:30, which means the next session is starting. We don't want to take any of their time. We can't take any of the time. The same rules applies. Please don't leave. There'll be a flying switch here. We'll just be handing over the baton. And thank you all for your time.